My name is Jeremiah Wells, and the topic of my paper is the effects of COVID on the film and television industry. All right, this is the background section. The film industry has always been a huge attraction in the United States of America, but in the 2010s is when the movie business was absolutely thriving at the box office of that decade. The lowest recorded total earnings in the year was 2011, which brought in $10.1 billion according to Box Office Mojo. The entire history of cinema, only 51 films have crossed the $1 billion mark, and only 2 of them were released before the year 2000. This statistic should put into perspective how well the film industry is doing was doing prior to the dreadful year of 2020. In 2020, the COVID pandemic broke out all over the globe, caused many nations to lock down, which greatly affected many facets of the economy. The film industry was no exception, with the whole world shut down for several months. The rampant fear among catching one of the various strains of the coronavirus drastically impacted the box office, causing profits to plummet. The U.S. box office dropped off 80%, and the global box office fell 71%. In America, the box office total was $2.1 billion in 2020, just to show how significant of a drop-off that was. The previous year, the number one movie was Avengers Endgame, which alone drew in $2.7 billion. Regal Theaters is one of the most successful movie theater chains, filed for bankruptcy and had to close over 30 locations because theaters have not recovered from the pandemic. If the box office does not get back on track, cinema will have to completely move to streaming platforms just to make a profit. We're all already seeing many smaller films going straight to streaming, and when big budget films flop in theaters, companies rush to get them available on digital platforms. The pandemic forced everyone to stay indoors, so people had to find more ways to entertain themselves since they were confined to their homes. What crippled the feature films and theaters had the opposite effect on television and streaming platforms, causing them to skyrocket in viewership. Shows like The Tiger King and Squid Games were all global phenomenons, which were released during the pandemic, and shows that had ended years ago found revival by people looking for shows to binge. The pandemic created a need for more content for people to watch, and more streaming platforms were created to capitalize on the increased demand for the content. Thesis of my paper: the film industry was negatively impacted by COVID-19, while the television industry experienced the opposite effect. Evidence providing these claims includes 155 films have been delayed since the start of COVID-19. Half of the population has not returned to theaters, and streaming platforms are still recording high viewership numbers. People have two different views on this topic that will ultimately decide the future of the film industry. First, we have viewers that truly love movies and go to the theaters to see them on the big screen. Others would rather watch movies from the comfort of a home. The ratio of this group is basically 1-to-1, but recent studies have shown more and more people are leaning towards watching movies from home. If that keeps rising, the theaters will have to shut down because there will not be enough revenue to keep the doors and lights on. Sayanka Gonzalez, in When the Film Industry Takes on COVID-19 Pandemic Experiences on Set, said that production companies had to delay over 155 films. 80 of them were directly delayed because of coronavirus outbreaks on set during 2021 and 2022. In the pre-COVID world, movies would be delayed for injuries of performers or weather interfering with production. But in these modern times, it's becoming increasingly common for films to be delayed for a multitude of reasons, COVID still being the most prevalent. Movies being delayed only affects the box office, but it also is not great for the crew. It costs more to keep the project in production, and it may mean taking a pay cut or layoffs for the crew. Even worse, it can lead to the cancellation of the film as a whole. Once the lockdown was lifted, I thought people would be flocking to theaters because they were sick of watching movies from home and missed the theater experience. I was shocked to the extent at which I was wrong. Brent Lang and Rebecca Rubin in How Movie Theaters Fought to Survive Another Turbulent Year of Change walked talked to the president of a chain of movie theaters called Studio Movie Grill about the current window of time films would remain in theaters before being removed. Tirlach Hutchinson, the vice president, said 2021 there were several films that were only in theaters for 12 days up to 45 days before switching to digital platforms. Many were released on both theaters and streaming platforms. Hutchinson said, if the window is 45 days, I do not have a problem with that because that is where 90% of gross happens in that time frame. The problem lies when the film struggles in the box office. It doesn't last the 45 days in the window. If a film is still making millions of dollars by the 45th day, it's still considered success despite how it may be received to general audience. Therefore, small budget films have a limited release in theaters to see if there is a big enough audience to warrant a wide release, which is a rare occurrence. Unlike movie theaters, streaming platforms really hit their stride while the pandemic came around. Cheyenne Karsh wrote in the Michigan Journal, Impact on Television Streaming Service, providing data to show how profitable COVID was for streaming. She cites that Netflix, in just the first 3 months of 2020, gained 15.7 million new subscribers, and Netflix stock skyrocketed. She said that while Netflix shares stocks amounted to $298.84 on March 16th, the price rose to $439.17 by April 16th, just 3 days later, and continues to rise. Disney Plus was a new streaming platform that was available in 2019. It already had 50 million subscribers before the pandemic. However, Hamilton was released, which caused a 74% increase of downloads of the app during the lockdown. Many households have multiple different streaming platforms so they can access all of the trending movies and TV shows, as well as having a large catalogs of titles to watch. Before the global outbreak of COVID-19, it was common for people to watch television and simply wait to stream it later. All the lockdown did was double down on that fact. March was the month that the lockdown was enacted. Karsh reported that there was a total of 156 billion minutes of total usage of streaming platforms on the week of March 16th. That more than doubled the number of minutes streamed during the same week a year prior. It was expected that these numbers would drop off, and while it has some, the amount of success TV show viewership has on streaming platforms are still higher than pre-COVID numbers. The film industry was negatively impacted by COVID-19, while television experienced the opposite effect. Evidence providing this claim is 155 films have been delayed since COVID-19. Half the population has not returned to theaters, and streaming platforms are still recording high viewership numbers. This is the lines of refutation. Not all people believe that theaters are going under. They think large franchise films like Marvel, Star Wars are enough to keep them in business. Kate Dahl said that the future of film in theaters after COVID-19, she argues that the theaters will thrive off of blockbuster franchises, and smaller indie films will have to go to streaming platforms to make money. Dahlia's biggest support for her claims is that of the top 10 highest grossing films of all time, 5 of them are Marvel movies and 7 of them are franchise films. While this is a compelling argument, by this logic, since more franchise films are being released in theaters, the box office should be making enough money to get back to its heights. However, since 2020, Marvel has released 4 films. Only one of them has crossed the $1 billion mark, No Way Home. In actuality, the quantity of these films has actually ended up hurting their box office earnings because the audience felt the quality of the films was being sacrificed in order to quickly churn out more movies. Larger film studios are learning that they can't afford to rush the writing and production of projects if they want to perform well in theaters. Marcy Delonte, in COVID isn't why Americans aren't going to movie theaters, conducted a study asking 2,200 moviegoers over the span of a month a series of questions to engage the attendance after the pandemic, and the results weren't promising. Along with the study, she found that if a film doesn't perform well in theaters, there's a window that is opened for the film from the theater to go to a streaming platform if it doesn't hit its projections. In her study, she found that 40% of moviegoers before the pandemic have not returned to theaters. On top of that statistic, 55% of participants would rather watch movies from the comfort of their home. 50% think theaters are just too expensive and do not want to Patreon the cinemas. A smaller group just aren't interested in the movies that are going to theaters. The studies should show This study should help one to see the bigger picture and understand why people don't go to the movies. While the reasoning are understandable, to completely quit going to the movie theater as a whole is an extreme action to take, because that this business that makes movies that people love can't make any money if the fans don't show up. While the reasons that theaters aren't an attraction they used to be, once we realize that, we can change it. There are some people that believe while streaming platforms numbers were impressive, all the electronic entertainment did well. Mark Beach in COVID-19 pushes up the internet use of 70%, streaming platforms more than 12. First Figures Forbes March 2020 conveys that all electronic devices usage went up during the lockdown. Beach's research shows that the internet use went up 70% during the lockdown, and Google, Amazon, YouTube had to lower their quality to adjust to the usage. While this is true, streaming platforms usage doubled, while others were just used to a higher degree. After the lockdown, these other apps dropped tremendously. Shows like Stranger Things, Wednesdays, The Last of Us, House of Dragons keep breaking records of viewerships and minutes streamed. The lockdown helped open people's eyes to all the entertainment and high-quality television and streaming platforms. The film industry was negatively impacted by COVID-19, while television experienced the opposite effect. Evidence providing this claim includes 155 films have been delayed since the start of COVID-19. Half the population has not returned to the theaters, and streaming platforms are still recording high viewership numbers. The conclusion: the data shows that the pandemic has crippled the theater and movie industry while simultaneously pushing streaming platforms to the forefront of entertainment. Theaters can be revived, but to do so, it will need the help of those who prefer to wait to watch the movies at home, who are completely quit, and those who have completely quit going altogether. The business is barely staying afloat, but with all this information and statistics I've shared, I hope to convince everyone to return to the cinemas. Movies and television create beautiful worlds that we can't go to, and characters that capture exactly what we are feeling. Movies are an escape, but can also show us that we are not alone, and that's what theaters do.